Okay, this is the second part of the 5.03 lesson, Reflections of War. Bombing in Cambodia, negotiating in Paris. At the same time, in order to emphasize his toughness, Nixon ordered attacks on bases and supply routes that the North Vietnamese had established inside the neighboring country of Cambodia. Codename Operation Menu, the campaign dropped more than 100,000 tons of bombs on Cambodia. The bombing runs were hidden from the press and the public because Nixon knew that he might cause an international crisis by admitting to attacks on a neutral country. Despite the massive scale of the bombing, Operation Menu failed to achieve its principal objective. North Vietnamese and NLF forces were still able to move adequate supplies through the lines. Even as he waged his secret war, Nixon pursued secret peace talks. He sent his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, to Paris to meet with North Vietnamese representative Luc Duc Tho, a founder of the Indochinese Communist Party and commander of early Viet Cong insurgencies in the south. The talks made little progress. Duc Tho made it clear to Kissinger that the bombing of Cambodia would not force the NVA out of South Vietnam. In April 1970, Nixon appeared on television to announce that he was sending ground troops into Cambodia. He declared, "If, when the chips are down, the world's most powerful nation, the United States of America, acts like a pitiful, helpless giant, the forces of totalitarianism and anarchy will threaten free nations and free institutions across the world." Peace with honor. After the 1970 Cambodia insurrection, the war raged on for years. As American troops withdrew, the war was fought more and more by Vietnamese soldiers with American air support. As the presidential election of 1972 approached, Nixon accelerated the timetable for withdrawal. By the end of 1971, the number of American troops in Vietnam had shrunk to 156,000, down from a high of 543,000. 6 months later, the total dwindled to 47,000. In Paris, the peace talks stalled. The North Vietnamese refused to the American demand that they withdraw all their troops from South Vietnam. The United States refused the North Vietnamese demand that it dispose of the South Vietnamese president. After winning re-election, Nixon ordered a massive bombing attack on the North Vietnamese cities of Hanoi and Hat Phong in December 1972. In the fiercest air assaults of the war, an estimated 1,600 civilians were killed by American bombs. Critics at home and abroad fiercely condemned the so-called Christmas bombing. The New York Times called the act an act of Stone Age barbarianism. The Prime Minister of Sweden said it was worthy of the Nazis. The bombing did succeed in forcing the North Vietnamese back to the Paris peace talks. On January 27, 1973, the negotiators signed an agreement. Nixon declared, "We have finally achieved peace with honor." Let's read this little excerpt before we move on. No heroes welcome. Soldiers returning from an increasingly unpopular war seldom received the hero's welcome that had greeted veterans of previous conflicts. Returning troops were sometimes jeered by anti-war activists. Some ordinary citizens steered clear of Vietnam veterans because they had read news stories about mentally ill vets committing crimes. One former Marine recalled, "This guy was telling me that he wouldn't hire a Vietnam vet. He thought we were all crazy." Returning home during a national recession, many Vietnam veterans faced unemployment. For the more than 300,000 soldiers who sustained physical wounds and countless more who suffered post-traumatic shock and depression, the Veterans Administration, the VA, hospital system proved woefully inadequate. One veteran recalled, "I went to Walter Reed Hospital first. They put me in a situation with about 34 people in the room. How in the heck are you going to talk to me about my problems with 34 other problems in your face? I went to the VA hospital in Baltimore and they gave me 2 aspirins and told me to go to bed and call in the morning." The fall of Saigon. Under the terms of the Paris Treaty, the South Vietnamese government in Saigon would remain intact for the time being, but the NVA would continue to occupy parts of South Vietnam. The United States would get the return of its prisoners of war in exchange for withdrawing all of its troops. For their roles in negotiating the agreement, Henry Kissinger and Luc Duc Tho shared the Nobel Peace Prize. Tho, however, refused his half of the prize, saying peace has not really been established. He was right. After the Americans left, fighting erupted again between the communist and non-communist Vietnamese. Nixon had promised to respond with full force if South Vietnam's existence was threatened. But he was driven from the White House by scandal, discussed in the later chapter, and Congress showed no appetite for renewed military action in Southeast Asia. Congress cut aid to South Vietnam, which nevertheless managed to hold out for 2 more years. In the spring of 1975, the NVA and Viet Cong finally defeated the South Vietnamese army and seized Saigon. As the communists closed in on the city, the U.S. sent helicopters to evacuate the few remaining Americans, as well as South Vietnamese who had worked for the United States and feared the revenge of the communists. Newspaper photographs of desperate civilians scrambling to board helicopters on the roof of the American embassy symbolize the tragic end of America's involvement in Vietnam. And here's the picture. They're trying to evacuate an embassy, and people are trying desperately to get on the helicopters, and like you'll see, like they said, if you search for images, you'll see people clinging to the I don't know the proper name, the leg of the helicopter. It's not, no, it's not a leg, but the helicopter as it's taking off, they're so desperate, they're clinging to that, and eventually they would fall to their death, but that's how desperate they were to leave. It's very sad. Soon after the fall of Saigon, South Vietnam's government quickly surrendered. Ho Chi Minh reunited North and South into a single communist nation, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The city of Saigon received a new name, Ho Chi Minh City. A bitter legacy. Peace had come to Vietnam, but at a terrible price. An estimated 1.5 million Vietnamese died in the conflict, along with 58,000 Americans. The United States dropped about 8 million tons of bombs on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, roughly 3 times the number of bombs dropped on Germany, Japan, and Italy combined during World War II. The victorious communists forced hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese soldiers and officials into re-education camps, where some would languish for as long as a decade. More than 1 million Vietnamese fled their country, wrecked by war and mired in poverty. Many of these refugees fled communist rule by sea. Many boat people drowned, while others spent years in refugee camps in neighboring countries. To some extent, Eisenhower's domino theory proved correct. Communist regimes seized power in neighboring Cambodia and Laos. In Cambodia, the communist regime called the Khmer Rouge instituted a monstrous campaign of genocide. During a 4-year reign of terror, the Khmer Rouge executed, starved, or worked to death some 1.5 million people. But contrary to earlier fears, communism did not spread throughout all of Southeast Asia. Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia remained non-communist. Much of the world had opposed America's involvement in Vietnam, seeing it as a war of aggression against a smaller nation. The opinion prevailed not only in communist states of the Soviet Union and China, but even among some of America's closest allies. For Europeans, the United States lost much of the moral authority it had gained with its victory in World War II and its implementation of the Marshall Plan. In Great Britain, along the largest demonstrations of the 1960s were those held against American policy in Vietnam. In France and Germany, radical students marched in the streets, chanting anti-American slogans. Even Europeans opposed to communism tended to criticize America's efforts in Vietnam. At home in the United States, the experience of Vietnam fed a growing distrust of the government. Those on the left believed the government had tried to deceive the people into supporting a brutal war of aggression. Those on the right charged the government had sent brave soldiers to fight a war for freedom and then refused to let them win it. For people across the political spectrum, the mention of Vietnam raised bitter emotions. Politicians could win applause by promising no more Vietnams. In a nation eager to forget a painful conflict, veterans suffered from a lack of recognition and sometimes outright discrimination. Yet perhaps in part because the experience was so demanding, most vets would look back on their service with pride. A 1980 poll found that 91% of veterans were glad to have gone to Vietnam, and 74% expressed a willingness to serve again. Vietnam veterans were reserved belated recognition when in 1991 they were invited to march in the parades held for soldiers returning from the first Gulf War. Here I am getting emotional again. Okay, I believe this is where we end here for this lesson. Yep. Oh, well, we can read about the Vietnam Memorial here in just a moment. But here's a picture of some of the Vietnamese people fleeing communist rule. They did not want to be caught in the crosshairs as the communist North Vietnam was taking over the South. And this is where we get a lot of the Hmong that have immigrated into the United States since the 1970s. A very large proportion left, were driven out by the communists for being an ally of America during the Vietnam era, and they went to refugee camps in Thailand and elsewhere and eventually emigrated to the United States. So that's part of the history of many of the immigrants that have come into the United States, particularly Minnesota and Wisconsin. There's a great deal of Hmong immigration population in this country, or in these states of Minnesota and Wisconsin. Okay, so we're going to stop here. I just want to see if we're supposed to read on. Just let me check back in the lesson. Okay, it actually says in the lesson that it doesn't give us these pages to read, but I'm going to read them anyway. Historical close-up, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. In Washington, D.C., in a remote part of the long open park known as the National Mall, between the towering Washington Monument and the stately Lincoln Memorial, lies a grassy swell. There, sunk into the ground, is a long V-shaped wall of polished black granite. It is all but invisible from the busy roads on three sides. Yet this apparently unspectacular sight attracts nearly 4 million visitors each year and is one of the most frequently visited memorials in the nation's capital. When visitors come to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, they walk along a pathway at the base of the wall. They approach the wall and read the names, more than 58,000 of the soldiers fallen or lost in the Vietnam War. Every visitor to the memorial sees himself or herself reflected in the polished stone. Most reach out and touch the name of a soldier, friend, family member, or stranger. And unlike most of the other memorials to fallen soldiers, visitors leave behind mementos, millions of them, letters, poems, photographs, flowers, medals, teddy bears. The call for the monument came from Vietnam veterans who set up a nonprofit organization to fund the project through private donations. An open competition brought in more than 1,400 design proposals. In 1981, a jury of distinguished architects and sculptors judged the anonymous submissions. They unanimously chose a design by Maya Lin, a 21-year-old Chinese-American student studying architecture at Yale University. The design stirred immediate controversy. Indeed, Lin's vision of a rift in the earth was unlike the typical war memorial depicting heroic figures. One critic called their design a black gash of shame and sorrow hacked into the national visage that is the mall. Despite the criticism, the construction began in 1982. In 1984, a statue of 3 servicemen was added to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and in 1993, another sculpture showing 3 women tending the wounded infantrymen was added to honor the women who served in the war, many as nurses. Whether honoring the valor of a fallen comrade, remembering a loved one lost in a faraway land, or paying tribute to those who received little in their day, Americans seem to be irresistibly drawn to the memorial. In this quiet place meant for personal reflection and private reckoning, as Maya Lin said in her original proposal, it is up to each individual to resolve or come to terms with this loss. For death is in the end a personal and private matter. Soldier by soldier, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial honors both individual sacrifice and the resilience of a nation to move beyond that troubled time. And it's a very moving experience. If you ever have a chance, do indeed go visit the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and the rest of the National Mall. It is just, it's just amazing, very personal experience. Okay, let's go back. Oh, we're on lesson 503. Let's go back to the right lesson. And we completed the reading, so don't forget to go to your reading guide, check your answers with a lesson answer key if you haven't done so, and then let's continue on. When the conflict in Vietnam first began, many Americans were unaware where Vietnam was located and why it was important. To complete this activity, you will need to print the What Happened Where activity sheet. You also use the interactive map at this link here. Okay, and then you need to have that sheet, so just a moment. Okay, so we look at the sheet here. When and where did Vietnam become a divided nation? What other 3 countries came into play? So on and so forth. So if we go back, and it'll just basically take you step by step. And I don't want to do a whole video on going through this, but you can work on that. And you also will need to go through and read the chapter highlights. Don't forget to do that. I would read them with you, but I'm going to run out of time and I don't want to start a 3rd section just for the chapter highlights. So don't forget to go through the chapter highlights. Review lessons 501, 502, and 503 before you take today's 503 quiz. Best of luck to you on the quiz and good luck.